And for our newcomers, we're excited to have you here with us today for the first time. 10 seasons, we have brought valuable conversations and insights to the table through our Your Brain at Work digital community. From our podcast recordings years prior to the live show, which initially kicked off in 2020 as a pandemic response. And we're thrilled to continue evolving as we dive more into this season. Today's discussion is part one of a three-part series. For the next 3 weeks, we'll be dissecting the pillars of our new solution, LEAD. Today, we're focusing on self-management within the realm of leadership development. So as I quickly share a few more housekeeping notes, drop in the chat in the comments where you're joining in from. Kenya, welcome. New York, Wisconsin, we love our global community. Nice. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is also going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned with today's conversation. We suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can get the most out of today's show, and it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. An Aussie-turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines, ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome to the co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. David, welcome back. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Shelby. Great to be here.
And our moderator for today is the managing editor of content at the Neuroleadership Institute. She has a PhD in biochemistry and worked for many years as a science writer and editor for the American Chemical Society, Mayo Clinic, Nature, New Scientist, and other clients before joining NLI's team as a senior writer in 2022. She now manages content for NLI, including blog posts and other thought leadership, case studies, and product literature. Please join me in welcoming Managing Editor of Content, Laura Cassidy. Welcome to the show, Laura. It's great to have you here, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Shelby. It's a pleasure to be moderating today's discussion on Leadership Essentials, Part 1, The Science of Self-Management. And it's exciting to see so many people joining us from around the world. So to kick things off, David, NLI is in the process of launching a complete off-the-shelf leadership program. And this is something we haven't done before. So why now?
Had a bit of a glitch there. Can you hear me now, Laura?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent, excellent. Had to change platforms there for a moment. I didn't hear your question if you asked one.
I'm sorry. So NLI is in the process of launching a complete off-the-shelf leadership program, which is something we haven't done before. So why now?
It's a good question. We've actually been building complete leadership programs for a long time, over a decade, probably 13 years. And for a long time, for the longest time, we've been doing that in a very kind of a custom way. So a company will come to us and say, look, we want to, we have this leadership model. Can you give us much stronger science to explain it and help us build leaders based on this model with real science? And we would come in, whether it was Microsoft or Intel or others, and build essentially build a platform underneath a leadership framework that it really explained properly, like how to manage yourself and how to motivate others, and the neuroscience of empathy and the neuroscience of insight, all these different things. And we did that a lot. And in parallel, we've been publishing really a lot in particularly the last 5 years. We've published a huge amount. And I feel like there's been almost like this giant puzzle, and we finally sort of filled in most of the pieces. And there's still a couple of pieces here and there, but like you can absolutely see the whole picture now. Like we really know what the picture of that puzzle is. And that giant puzzle is essentially, it's basically all the foundations that you would need if you were trying to make someone a better, a much more effective manager through the lens of like really understanding the brain moment to moment. And so we were able to build this like full picture now of pretty much anything that you want to teach people. We're able to explain from a biological perspective why that skill or habit is important, and most importantly, how to do it better, and do all that with real evidence-based research. And it sort of doesn't matter if it's like, just how to, manage your attention better, all the way through to how to run meetings better, like, and everything in between. It's like we have this full picture now. And as I said, definitely some gaps. And then what happened was, we started to see a lot of our partners. We have like 300 partners, in a year. A lot of our partners are doing this amazing work with what we call a pathway, where they're like, starting with growth mindset, teaching the whole organization growth mindset, and then maybe going to inclusion, teaching the whole organization inclusion, and then, something else. And so we've had these whole of company pathways, right? With, each set of habits being a month. And what we saw is that organizations were still doing these sort of foundational leadership programs, and it was causing a lot of confusion and kind of what we call model muddle. And so, you'll come along, you'll learn these good skills, and then you'll go to this foundational manager program, and you'll have to remember 5 different models that don't make sense and don't kind of fit with everything else that you've learned. So we said, oh, look, let's see if we can build something that has all the foundations that you would need as a real foundational manager or leadership experience. And probably the one reason we didn't do it up to now is it's actually really hard. It's like the choices you have to make to do this are really difficult. Like, which habits really matter the most, and why, and what's the ideal science, the ideal story, all that. So it's actually a really hard thing to do, to say, all right, we've got one framework for being a more effective manager or leader. But that's we've taken the last year to build that.
Okay. So the first part of this 3-part program is managing yourself. And as we know, leaders need to effectively manage teams and other people. So why did you decide to begin the program with managing yourself?
Well, let's take this off the program. This isn't about a training, right? This isn't about a product, okay? This is about the skills and habits that people need to be more effective as a manager and leader, right? And it's this, the mission of building this has been fascinating. But let me first of all kind of give some background. Let's anchor on a sort of something real, right? Let's imagine an organization of 10,000 people, fairly spread out, right? That means about 1,000 people managers, right? 10,000 employees, about 1,000 people who manage folks, right? Of that 1,000, a good 900 of those are first-time, frontline managers, maybe managers of managers, maybe senior managers, and maybe one level up. And then maybe 100 of them you might think of as executives, and maybe 10 of them you might think of as kind of C-suite, right? So people would confuse leadership and management and all this. We've gone down this path a lot. We believe that there are foundational skills and habits that are essential for every one of those 1,000 people. And you kind of have to use different kind of scenarios and situations and stories to sort of bring it alive at the very top end. And the top end does need some additional things, like, all right, let's think about managing stakeholders and running a P&L and these kinds of things, right? But the top 100 kind of need extra things, but they actually still need the exact same common language as the other 900, right? And so we basically built something that we wanted to build something that was relevant to all 1,000, but in particular, just like as is, was relevant to 900, right? So 90% of an audience. And so the question became what do people need to understand to be more effective? The majority of leaders, what do they need to understand to be more effective? And I actually struggled with this question a lot. This question of, should you start with managing yourself, or should we go straight to kind of how to interact with others, because there's a lot of skills and habits around interacting with others. Obviously, there's a whole world. And we went back and forth, and in the end, we said, look, actually, you need to start with managing yourself. And there's so many reasons why that's important. And one of them is there's this really critical set of language skills that you kind of need to apply to your own brain before you can apply it to other people's brains. Like, for example, like knowing how to have more, bursts of creativity, like knowing how to solve a problem creatively, right? You need to understand that in your own brain and be able to do that with yourself. Then you can help other people do it. Or managing emotions, right? You're actually really, really helpful to know how to manage your emotions yourself before you kind of help others do that. So we just said, look, we should start with people, and kind of let's go on a journey of what are the most important habits and skills that people need to basically manage themselves. And so that's kind of that's why we started there.
Got it. Okay. Can you walk me through the science behind optimizing your brain, how a leader can optimize their own brain?
Yeah, for sure. So that's where we start. So firstly, the 3 habits that we think are really the most important, and we're not trying to be exhaustive, we're trying to be essential. We're saying, look, for managing yourself, we think there are 3 essential habits. Optimize your brain is one, regulate emotions is another, and then sustain good thinking is the third one. So we think of those as habits, and then there are skills within each of those. So as you're optimizing your brain and really managing your own brain, which is different to managing emotions, similar but different, there is a subset of that, like 3 specific skills. So it's this optimize your brain. What happens when you first become a manager, or you get promoted to a new level, or just in the course of being a manager, you hit up against overwhelm really fast. Like the amount of information that people have to process is huge. And usually, like an individual contributor that then becomes a manager just goes into complete overwhelm for quite some time. And so you do need this ability to kind of get the most out of our limited capacity. So we start with this capacity question. Like we start with, like, right at the beginning of kind of understanding yourself is this question of what is our capacity to solve problems and make decisions, and what are the limitations to it, and how do we work around those limitations. So that's kind of where we start. And so it's literally like looking at how working memory works and what do we need to do to get the most from that. For example, there's a skill called externalizing, right? Externalizing means just don't store anything in your brain you don't have to, so that you use your brain to see connections between things rather than storing things, right? Like moment to moment. You're literally like moment to moment, just like don't hold anything in here, have it out here on paper or a computer or a flip chart or a wall or whatever, so that you're maximizing your limited resources, right? So that's an example of of something that people really need to do, externalize, right? So optimize my brain, we start with this question of like, how do we maximize this limited capacity? And we call the skill sharpen focus, right? Like really improve how we focus. And there's a lot in that. Now, the way we've structured this is we've built a 6-month journey, and you can do it slower if you want to, you could do it faster, but it's about 1 skill a week, right? So you might spend a week working on this question of getting more out of your capacity, out of your working memory capacity. So you might spend a whole week on that, right? And explore like externalizing and other skills, but also like dig into the science a bit, really get to understand your brain, and then also kind of interact with other people who are on the same journey. So that's just like that's 1 skill within optimize my brain. It's just like deal with limited capacity. The interesting thing is we can't solve problems. We can't solve that many problems with this conscious capacity by like trying to solve them. We actually need the insight phenomena. The insight phenomena is basically our unconscious solving a problem for us, right? And we need space for a lot more insight. So as a manager or leader, the more you go up in an organization, the more complex the problems are, the more you need insights. But insights require a quiet mind and a certain way of processing. And generally what happens is, people have a busier and busier mind as they go up, right? So the second skill is learning to, we call it get unstuck, learning to get unstuck. So, when you can't solve a problem logically, even though you've really like worked on your focus and worked on your capacity, what's the mechanisms for getting unstuck? And that's fascinating. Again, people spend a week on just like really learning how to have more insights. And we think it's incredibly helpful to understand the science of that, so you can actually like really see the processes in real time in your brain. And I think that's what makes these habits stick. So the second skill there is learning all about insight. But then the third one is interesting. You'll have this sudden insight, but then a part of the time it'll just be bias. It'll be just like, your experience coming back, right? And it's really important as you're like, making decisions and solving problems that you check yourself for potential bias, because bias is absolutely huge. As we say, if we have a brain, you have bias. So, pretty early on, we introduced a framework called the SEEDS model, which is the 5 categories of bias, and give people a tool to check. So this whole first habit, right? Optimize my brain. If you imagine that's it's about 3 weeks, right? So over 3 weeks, you imagine learning a lot more about getting more out of limited capacity. So, focusing better. You get a whole lot more insights happening, but you also learn to challenge those insights, right? And just make sure you're not being biased. So that whole, habit we call optimize my brain. And you imagine, people could get a lot out of that. And it's such a foundational thing to start with.
Yes, definitely. So you mentioned another habit in managing yourself is regulating your emotions, which is obviously a very important skill for leaders to have. Can you explain the science behind this habit?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a really, really important one. I mean, the reality is that both working memory capacity, right? And working memory is like the deliberate problem solving. Both working memory capacity and insight problem solving, right? Both of those things are in a seesaw with emotions. So when you have strong emotions, you have a lot less ability to solve problems creatively and logically, right? Then particularly the creative side reduces a lot. Like you have even moderate emotions, you have very little ability to be creative. So really as a manager and leader, there's sort of 2 things that are important. Firstly, you want as much working memory as you can. Working memory is this concept of like a mental sketch pad. It involves the prefrontal cortex. It's like activating something you're holding online, like thinking about, right? So you want as much working memory as possible, and you also want as much insight as possible. And this requires essentially keeping your brain in what we call a slight towards state, right? A slight towards state means that you're open, interested, curious, not anxious at all. You feel you're just kind of calm. You're not excited. You're not like, passionate, right? You're just kind of curious, open. So you're just slightly, in a towards state, slightly leaning in. That's the optimal state for logical problem solving and creative problem solving, right? So it's a really difficult thing though, because managing anyone and anything requires like being seen by others, which is hugely threatening, having way too much than you can possibly do, which is massively threatening, right? And having all this pressure on you as well. So the very nature of managing people creates a threat response for managers. But the more the more senior you go, the stronger the threats are, and the more important it is to actually manage them, right? So for your own decision-making, problem solving, it's so important that you can regulate your emotions really, really well. And that skill becomes more important as you go up. But the other side of it is that your team, like if you manage a team of 10 people, like those 10 people are heavily influenced by your mental state, right? So think of a mental state on a continuum of toward to away. So toward on the right, is, open, excited, really excited, right? The away is just like slightly anxious, stressed and overwhelmed, right? We in our work, we talk about level 1, 2, and 3 threat, right? Level 1 threat's like slightly anxious. Level 2 is stressed, and level 3 is overwhelmed. You can't think at all, right? So even if you're just in like that level 1 threat as a manager, just slightly anxious, when your team sees you, before you say anything, or if they hear you, right, you don't even see you, before you say anything, they read your emotional state and it becomes additive to theirs, right? So in other words, they're at a level 1 threat, you're at a level 1 threat, they're now at a level 2 threat. Like they get more anxious. And I mean, I think an easy way to understand this is if you're in an army platoon, you want your captain to look super like cool under pressure. You want your captain to look like they've got it all together, not look panicked, right? You look at your captain looks panicked, you get really panicked. And the more panicked the most senior person is, the more panicked everyone is. And so it's more than just sort of not getting overly stressed. It's actually managing to stay in a slight toward state when everyone else is falling apart, because it actually helps them come up. So there's basically 2 reasons why this is such a foundational skill for managers. Firstly is you just need it to make difficult decisions. And secondly, you need it so that everyone else can make difficult decisions. Because when you make everyone else stressed, their ability to make decisions logically and creatively also goes down, right? So it's such an important skill set, emotional regulation. One of my favorite trickle-down panic, absolutely. One of my favorite researchers in this space, James Gross at Stanford. He's really the founding father of emotional regulation research, and fascinating guy. Spent some time with him. He's spoken at a few of our summits. We should get him back. But he really had this big breakthrough in our understanding of emotions. Before he was studying emotions, people would sort of look at them in terms of kind of factor analysis and trying to understand them. But he changed the paradigm of studying emotions formally. And basically what he did was he looked at them over time. And what he found is that you understand emotions much better if you know where people are on a time horizon around that emotion. Because essentially before an emotion kicks in, there are things that you can do that are really different to after an emotion kicks in, right? And he's got some complicated language around this. But essentially, before an emotion kicks in, you can kind of, get out of the room so you don't have to deal with that person, or, there's different choices you can make. Once an emotion kicks in, it's a bit like kind of drinking 2 double scotches on an empty stomach. Like before you drink it, you can do something. But once you've started drinking, once you've drunk that, that liquid, it's gonna run its course through you biologically for some hours, right? And emotions are like that. Once they kick in, your choices become more limited. And there's really 3 choices. One of them is expression, is sort of let the emotion out. If you're a trained actor, that's like you're really good at that. And sometimes we're being taught to like, hey, don't hold emotions, don't suppress them, express them, right? Let them out. That is not an adaptive thing as a manager, because your emotions mostly involve wanting to throttle your team or yell at your boss or, yell at a customer, right? So but expressing emotions is a really bad idea. But what we do otherwise is we simply try to suppress them. And James's research is so fascinating. He actually set up scenarios where people tried suppressing emotions, and what he found is that and literally they were looking in the brain at the amygdala and other threat networks while people are trying to do this. Research was done with Kevin Oxner at Columbia, and what they found is that you can't suppress emotions successfully. You feel like you can, but actually the emotions are the same or worse. And what that means is that your ability to process the world well is like really bad. So you're trying to suppress emotions so you can think. It actually makes your whole threat center worse. But really fascinating is there's a secondhand smoke effect, is that other people now are literally uncomfortable and their blood pressure goes up even. Other people experience a threat because there's this gap between kind of what you're saying and what you're really obviously feeling. And the uncertainty of that kind of creates a big threat for other people. So trying to suppress emotions is a really bad idea. And then what he found is that there are different, the third category is cognitive change strategies, right? But there's a bunch of those and lots of different research. And it took us a long time to organize and synthesize that research. But what we found is that for lower level emotions like that level 1 threat, you can do something called labeling, right? Like, why am I so uncomfortable going to this meeting? Oh, that's right. I had an argument with this person once before, right? Oh, okay, that's what it is. Now I feel better, right? So labeling works for lower level emotions. For stronger emotions, like level 2, you actually need reappraisal. And I won't go into all of the science of that, but we teach that in the program. Reappraisal is fascinating. It's essentially altering your interpretation of an event so that you alter your response to it. But it's interesting. A lot of really rational, logical people think, no, I shouldn't reappraise. That's just like living in, fantasy land. I should just deal with, grin and bear it, deal with the reality, deal with emotions. You live longer, you live healthier, you live happier, you have less depression, you have better friendships, you have a more successful life, according to how much you reappraise when strong emotions come along. This is one of the studies that Gross found, is like this one variable determines quality of life on just about every vector, just like how much you reappraise when strong emotions come along. It's really, really fascinating. And so it's a really important power skill because you get a lot of strong emotions. So, we spent a whole week on just like understanding toward and away and that seesaw and then kind of labeling. And then we spent a whole week on reappraisal, like really learning what reappraisal is and how to get good at it. It's such a foundational skill. And and then some people might spend weeks on it. Some people might just kind of pause and go deeper and watch some other videos and get into some other content and really work on this question. So labeling and reappraisal, and then for the really strong threat responses, like the level 3 threats, when you're overwhelmed, cognitive strategies don't really work. So at that point, you got to kind of take a walk, like literally take a 30 or 60-minute walk to kind of help the cortisol get out of your system, right? Or have a nap, or just walk away and come back overnight. So the strong emotions, it's really helpful to understand that there's not really much cognitive strategy you can do. Sometimes you can use humor, but humor is a type of reappraisal. It's kind of cheap reappraisal because it's easier to do. Anyway, so the whole module 2, regulate emotions, is about like how do you keep yourself like in that state of just to the right of neutral, right? How do you keep yourself in that slight towards state for as a manager for yourself, but also for your team? And then how do you do that? By labeling, by reappraisal, and by logical strategies. So essentially, you spend a lot more time in that state. And, with that as a skill, managers are so much more effective, in that way. So I'm doing a lot of talking, not leaving much space for you to ask questions.
That's okay. That's really fascinating research. So as for reappraisal, can you give us an idea of how that works? How could you reappraise something?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. Like, if I'm at the airport and it's like 30 minutes before my flight and I can't see my gate, my heart is right up. I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta, like, maybe they've closed the flight, maybe, then way off in the distance, I'll see the gate and I'll see a long line, right? And just seeing the long line, my heart rate will go down automatically. So I'd appraised a potential danger and I changed it, and without trying to do anything, my heart rate automatically went down. So it's changing the interpretation you've made of a situation, right? And reappraisal is similar to reframing. It's like an active mechanism inside cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy and many other therapies. It's shifting an interpretation, because it's the interpretation that actually creates a stress response. So in the lab, like when James Gross was studying this, they would use things like looking at someone in a hospital bed that looks really, really sick, and your response would be like feeling anxious for that person, and then they'd say no, they're so much better, they were so much worse 2 days ago, they were really on a deathbed, this is actually a great improvement. And then you see the whole brain changing, right? Or you see people crying outside a church and it looks like a funeral, and then they say no, here's, and you pull back a bit and they say no, look, it was a wedding, these are tears of joy, and you go, oh, and your whole brain So we make these interpretations, right? And this is a power tool. Reappraisal is a power tool. The challenge is hard. You've got to look at the situation. You've got to be willing to see multiple interpretations of it, and then choose one that actually really does help change your perspective. Sometimes it's like, it's an interesting word, perspective. Sometimes it's like looking at it over time, like, oh, let's imagine how I'm going to feel 5 years from now, or how would I feel, telling this as a joke to a friend in 2 years, or how would my old boss see this, or so it's like changing your whole frame sometimes, right? It's not just like, oh, I want to just look on the bright side, but anything that changes your appraisal of the event can really turn it down. And this is really powerful. This is, we see that when you do this well, you're activating the brain's braking system. That's braking. So you're activating the brain's braking system, and this is super helpful for turning down threat. So the braking system's in the prefrontal, and it's actually reversing the seesaw, right? So when threat goes up, the limbic system gets activated, the prefrontal gets deactivated. Now, when you label and reappraise, you activate the prefrontal and you turn down the limbic system. So you're reversing the seesaw. But it's a really, really powerful skill. It's a really good one to be practicing and really workshopping. And so I think quite a few people will sort of spend some time on that module, and really dig in. We published, by the way, a bit in the very first journal we did it. We published a paper called The Brain's Braking System. If you're a member of the Institute, it's a really helpful paper. And we published one on labeling, and we've talked a lot about reappraisal. It's also in my book, Your Brain at Work. There's a lot about reappraisal and James Gross's work.
I see we have a question from the audience, so we could address that now.
Yeah.
Lisa's asking, how can leaders and managers balance managing their own emotions with supporting their employees in an environment that for some is activating constant threat and anxiety?
Yeah. I mean, you've got to, there's that saying, put your own oxygen mask on first, right? You can't make any good decisions or have good judgment at all if your brain's on fire. So you kind of have to manage yourself first. And to some degree, a lot of that for particularly someone starting out as a manager, like a lot of that is about buffering. You've got to actually like put buffers in against threat responses. So you want to like create a lot of a sense of control in your life and create a lot of certainty in your life and have a lot of positive social interactions so that you're kind of really well resourced, right? So it's about intentionally creating buffers so that you're overall generally positive and resourced, right? So that when a threat comes along, you as a manager are actually okay. And we talk about that in the third habit in sustained good thinking. Like we look at what are the practices you can put in place so that you're more likely to stay in that towards state. That's the third habit, right? But it's so important. You've got to kind of manage yourself first, and then you can help others. And one of the best ways you can help others is just by you being calm, and you being cool under pressure, and that's really key. And then with helping others, we get into that in the second module. We're not going to talk so much about that today, but next week I think we're coming back to that. So we'll look next week at sort of some of the core science and habits of helping others turn down their threat response. But today we're focused more on kind of managing yourself. Yeah, we've got time for one or two more quick questions. Anything else jumping out?
I see one question from Tresha. Is this the same as the techniques shared in the Positive Intelligence Program?
I don't know the Positive Intelligence Program. I know that that there are about 1.5 million books on leadership, and that they pretty much say the same 15 to 20 things. If you look at it, if you understand a bit about cognitive science and you look at those 1.5 million books, which of course is impossible, but you just look at, even 20 books, 30 books, 40 books, what you see are the same like cognitive processes being addressed in different language, right? So, I know the positive psychology, work pretty well. What they're doing is trying to orient you into that towards state, right? They're teaching different strategies that help you reappraise so that you're getting back to that. So essentially you're building this right and left ventrolateral prefrontal network. You're building this network so that you can change your responses. So what I know is across the board, any leadership program that works is you're changing people's brain, and it turns out there's only a relatively limited set of things that people really need in that way. And I think the more you can actually speak about the brain mechanisms, the easier it is, particularly for like rational people, engineers and doctors and academics and, just people who've been academically trained. Like the more you can talk about the concrete things going on in the brain, the easier it is to kind of for people to process. So that's what we do. We sort of try not to have too many models, or even if we have them, just like, let's quickly explain this in the brain so that people have a metaphor, a visual metaphor. They can actually see the concepts in that way.
Okay, let's take one more question before moving on. Here's a good one on reappraisal. How do you use reappraisal when the threat is not situational, like you can't see the airport gate, and it's more personal, a threat to your values or identity?
Yeah, that's a really, really difficult one. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of situations that are very, very hard to reappraise, and, sometimes we have a really difficult situation and 6 months later, we have an insight about it because we're finally not upset every time we think about, that person. So, because threat responses reduce your ability to reappraise, right? Threat responses reduce this network, and you need this network to reappraise. So it can be really difficult. Something that really hits with your values often is just create such a deep threat that it's hard to think well. And there are things called sacred values that are really hard to kind of undo when when that hits. Why don't we go to module 3? I want to make sure we get to not module 3, the habit 3. So we've talked about optimize my brain, right? And in there we're talking about like managing limited capacity, having more insights, making sure those insights aren't biased. We talked about regulating emotions, so understanding what emotions are and the importance of managing them, knowing how to actually manage kind of everyday emotions, like there's level 1, how to manage the level 2 and the level 3 emotions as well. But the third habit here, and we talk about habits and skills, right? The third major habit in managing yourself is sustain good thinking. And you really need to do very, very good thinking as a manager. So what's this about? So the first skill that we looked at is just like understanding what motivates you, and understanding what creates the threats that you experience and the rewards that you experience. And maybe this is a bit of an answer to someone's value question a moment ago. But this is where we introduced the SCARF model for the first time in the program. And both SCARF and SEEDS are like throughout the whole experience, but it's the first time we come to SCARF. So SCARF is the primary colors of motivation, engagement, psychological safety, inclusion, belonging, and a few other things. It's basically like what happens in the brain when humans interact with other humans: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. And what we're doing with sustaining good thinking is like knowing your SCARF profile a bit. So if you're someone who loves autonomy, it's really good to know that and kind of organize your life accordingly, and also know why you get so upset when someone tells you what to do. So it's kind of a labeling and reappraisal tool in some ways, SCARF. But it's also a tool for kind of organizing your life so you're getting fed the things that you need. So sustained good thinking starts with understanding your own motivations through the SCARF lens. And then we get into this buffering question that I mentioned. And we have a framework called the Healthy Mind Platter, which we published about 10 years ago now. And it's essentially the things that your brain needs to stay like at its peak. Now, the obvious one is, sleep time, right? You need a certain amount of sleep. It's really interesting. Everyone has a very individual sleep number. Some people it is 3 or 4 hours. Some people it is 10 to 12 hours. Most people are like 7.5 to 8.5 in there. But whatever your sleep number is, if you get just an hour less sleep, it shows up in cognitive tests like that day and even the next day. So you really want to manage your sleep well as one of the foundations. Interestingly, when you have less sleep than you need, particularly over a bit of time, you don't remember positive things, but you really remember negative things, and it starts a downward spiral. So sleep is one, but there's also like one of the most important types of time that we need to spend is actually playtime, like novelty and lightness and new connections, right? And so we talk a lot about playtime, but there's also downtime. A lot of people get downtime really wrong. Downtime is not watching television, it's not reading a book, it's actually being very unfocused, ungoal focused, right? So the Healthy Mind Platter, super helpful frame for kind of thinking about the types of attention that you have. Most people just have like sleep time, focus time, and a little bit of physical time, if that. And they're missing downtime, play time, time in, which is reflection time. And you can't have all these every day, but it's like over the week, you're going to make sure you're having sufficient one of these. And so this was about, to Jean's question, this was about the types of attention, the types of like time that you spend versus like the dietary needs or nutrition needs or things like that. That's kind of a different axis. So we were looking at sort of like, how do you spend your time? And it turns out some of these things like social needs actually have a bigger impact than diet on well-being. In fact, getting the quality and quantity of social connections that you want is one of the biggest variables for longevity. It turns out it's a much bigger variable than health, for health than diet or exercise, even many other things. So social time ends up being really important. It quiets the nervous system and increases the immune response, turns down the cortisol response. So we're looking at it from a different perspective in that way. So anyway, that's so sustained good thinking. We think that the three critical skills: firstly, like really understand your SCARF profile and be getting those things. Secondly, work with the Healthy Mind Platter and look at the kind of what you're doing with your time. And then the third one we finished with, we were sort of really debating, do we start with this or finish with it in module 1? But just definitely the mindset with which you're approaching everything that you're learning and doing as a manager, right? And it's such important. It's so important to have a growth mindset. And a growth mindset is essentially, you don't really care about looking good or being perfect or getting everything right. Right, you care about getting better and improving, and doing your best and making progress and really learning from other people and all that. And those are two very different pathways, right? You're either trying to look good or you're trying to get better, right? You can't really do both at the same time, right? You're either trying to sort of prove that you're smart, prove that you're a good manager, or you're trying to improve, right? And if you're trying to improve, you want lots of feedback, you want to ask a lot of people for input. You want to learn from other people, you want to set stretch goals, you want to do all that. But if you're trying to sort of prove that you're a good manager, you want to hide your mistakes, you want to, you don't want feedback and all this. So the third and final skill in sustained good thinking is like really how to nudge yourself towards a growth mindset. And you can imagine that's such an important skill for nudging other people. So it sounds like a lot, right? 3 habits: optimize my brain, regulate emotions, sustain good thinking. And I've walked through 9 habits. But that said, that's over 9 weeks. So it's over like quite a lot of time. And you might have a break in between. So it ends up being, over a couple of months, like, 2.5 months, really. So you're spending some time on this, but the idea is to spend time on each of these, learning, but also interacting with other people, learning together, and really building these as long-term sustainable habits for yourself. So it's about a 2.5 month experience of just kind of learning to manage yourself. And there's, so much more we could teach. We've tried to stick to the real essentials rather than being, overly exhaustive.
Sure. If we could go back to the SCARF model for a moment. As managers, when someone challenges our idea or decision, it's likely to threaten one or more of our SCARF domains, for example, our status. How can we move past that to be effective leaders?
Yeah, I mean, it does. So it's a really important thing that we can recognize those threats, when they happen. And if you know SCARF, you actually have a tool for labeling and reappraising as threats come up. So it's like, that, if someone like says that was a dumb idea, that you're going to experience a status threat, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's just my brain having a status threat. So you can kind of label it and reappraise it. It really helps you to know those things. And it's not a silver bullet, doesn't fix everything, but it gives you a much better chance of responding more adaptively and less like reactively in that way.
Okay, well, thanks for that great overview of the program, David. Now you're calling this program a habit activation platform, or HAP. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So one of my favorite mantras in our work is follow the science, experiment, follow the data. Right, follow the science, experiment, follow the data. And we've had the privilege of doing like original research about things like learning and habit activation and insight and all this stuff. And there's all these surprises in the research, when you dig in. And so we've been, for like 10 years now, we've been doing these really pretty radical experiments that follow the science. And honestly, the kinds of experiments that we have no idea if they're going to work or not. Like the first time we tried this concept of a distributed learning solution, it was a complete experiment. We had no idea if it would work, but there was like the science suggested it might, and it ended up working so much better than we thought. And essentially the spacing effect, like spacing out learning, has a much bigger effect than people intuitively predict. So you can like have a lot less intense learning, but add spacing, and you end up with like much stronger effect than if you had really, really intense learning in a block. So, you give me an example, you can take like a 6-hour classroom experience and you might get more people building more habits if it was like 2 hours or even 1 hour rather than 6 hours, if that's spread out over time. And so we've been doing these experiments for a long time, and our data, in our data, we were actually able to see that some of our virtual learning modalities were much more effective at building long-term habits. And we measure long-term habits like 6 months later. We can see the data 6 months later. We can see that in-person learning experience was literally the worst at building long-term habits, not accounting for the incredible cost and lack of scale and all those things, right? And so we've always been experimenting and thinking, and we have this formula for building habits, and it's really, you need 3 things. We believe you need 3 things. You need people to have a strong insight experience, that aha moment where you suddenly see something, right? So if you're trying to get people to manage sleep better, they need to have some kind of insight about the importance of that and the impact of that. And that comes ideally from a story and from research combined, right? Some kind of great story, some kind of great research, right? And they need to be paying attention, to all that. So you need an insight moment. Now, when that insight moment happens in a social context, you end up with a stronger insight, and it's a more recallable insight later. It's just the way the social brain works. You pay more attention when you're interacting with others, you care more, the networks are richer, all of this. So our formula is like strong insight in social situations, 1 habit at a time over time. And so we've been designing all sorts of different learning initiatives that scale with that formula. Like for some clients, like a series of podcasts that go out to 50,000 people, right? That create insights over time and getting groups talking about them. There's all these creative ways that you can create insight socially over time. And so we've never really got seriously into the digital business, into like, sort of digitizing our work, because we hadn't worked out how to create strong insight and still do it socially. And then we had a breakthrough in that, sort of with technology catching up with the help of AI now, is that we're actually able to imagine building a completely digital experience that's more effective than putting people in person, right? So if you've got 1,000 managers, right, 10,000 employees, 1,000 managers, we believe, and we'll have data at some point to prove this, we believe strongly we can make those 1,000 managers much more effective managers, without them ever meeting each other, without them ever going to a synchronous classroom, without ever being in a synchronous Zoom session, like completely digitally. We can make them more effective as managers that way than we can putting them, say, for example, 5 days in a workshop. And that's a hell of a bet. It's a hell of a statement. But the reason for that is A, the spacing effect, B, the social effect, and also just kind of where technology is. So habit activation platform is essentially a digital platform that gives people the opportunity to slowly have these insights with others over time. I know next week we're going to look deeper at this. We have a session, I think it's Wednesday, 11 till 2 Eastern. Maybe my team can put the link in there, but we've got what we call a leadership development mini summit. So we'll be digging more into the actual kind of platform and the solution, and we'll be demoing that a bit and kind of showing people what it really feels like. But the concept is you can basically build habits at any scale through a digital platform, and you can certainly add synchronous things. You might say, oh, I want to add some Zoom sessions, or I want to add an in-person day, or I want to add some other things around it. I want to add one-to-one coaching, or maybe all of the above. Maybe you want to add some virtual and some in-person and some one-to-one coaching, but the platform kind of pulls it all together in that way. So that's a habit activation platform. So what I've talked through today is the big ideas inside managing yourself. And what's important about these is that you need these habits in order to mobilize others, right? You want to help others be more effective. It's super helpful to understand limited capacity, right? Insight, bias, all the things we talked about. It's super, super helpful for you to have that language yourself before you learn how to mobilize others. And that's what we're going to start working on next week. I'm going to kind of walk you through the habits of that in detail.
Great. Well, we're nearing the end of our time together today. David, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I just, I appreciate the opportunity to talk this through. We haven't kind of had a chance to do that. And I guess, the final thing, two things, just, if you're interested in exploring this in your organization, just put the word lead in the chat, and someone will follow up with you and send you some resources, maybe set up a time to chat. But just put the word lead if you're from an organization. If you're interested, in checking this out individually, we actually just last week did something crazy. We opened up for open enrollment. We're going to run an open enrollment cohort of this starting in February. And if my team could just put the link in the chat, and we will, you can just kind of click on that and check it out. You can also put the word open in the chat, and someone will follow up with you. But it's a pretty simple thing. So if you're interested personally, put open in the chat and we'll send you out the link. But if my team can put the link in the chat directly as well, that would be good. I think it's on the homepage of Neuroleadership. So you'll be able to register for that now. We opened it up just in the last week. You'll be able to register for that and get in those first few programs and experience this journey for yourself. We've never really done that, so we're excited to see what happens there. So Tony's just put that link in the chat. If you're from an organization, if you're for an individual, if you're from an organization, put lead in the chat, and you'll be able to follow up. I think that's probably everything there. Laura, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about this. Thanks everyone for your interest in the work. We continue to think deeply about developing better leaders and managers. I think that these skills and habits are super important. We're excited to find a way to scale these. So hopefully join us next week, the week after, as we dig further into the experience. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us for this session. And now I'll turn things back to you, Shelby.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you both so much for today's discussion. There were a lot of wonderful insights. Now for closing, let us know how NLI can help you. We will share our poll, and that will stay up for a few more moments while I share some final announcements. So if you weren't able to join us at this year's summit, we do have an on-demand pass. So you are able to see previous panels and everything that happened at the experience. It was a wonderful time in New York. And so if you're interested in getting that, our team will share the link. Also, as David mentioned, we'll be hosting our next virtual mini summit on the topic of leadership. So mark your calendars for December 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern time, when we will come together and discuss a variety of topics surrounding leadership development with some of our own internal senior leaders as well. And the team will also share that registration link one more time if you missed it. And then specifically specifically for our senior executives, if you enjoy your Brain at Work Live, you'll love our Insider program. We invite you to join this exclusive opportunity to enjoy benefits such as first looks at new research, roundtable discussions with our leaders, and so much more. So if you are interested, we will also share the link in the chat. And then if you enjoyed today's conversation, we have a podcast. So if anywhere you listen to your podcast, you can check out your Brain at Work, and there will be episodes from the past as well as this episode too. And saying farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes, thank you so much for being here. We'll see you same time next week. Have a wonderful weekend.